The autumn sun cast a pale glow over the Collins small town in Vermont, a place where the maple trees burned orange and gold against the chill of early October. The Collins farmhouse, a white clapboard home with a sloping roof and creaking porch, sat at the edge of a meadow that once echoed with their children's laughter. For Margaret Collins, 60 years old, with streaks of silver running through her chestnut hair and lines carved deep into her face from both worry and joy, this house was not just walls and wood. It was memory, love, and also grief. She stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at the withered flowers on the windowsill, and for a moment, her heart clenched. They were the same flowers her youngest daughter Lydia had brought last week, smiling with that soft, rehearsed tenderness that Margaret sometimes found too polished, too perfect. Margaret was a tall woman, her frame still elegant despite age, her once bright green eyes now dulled with the weight of past tragedies. She had always been practical, resilient, the kind of woman who could mend clothes, balance the farm books, and comfort a crying child in one breath. Yet beneath that strength, she carried scars no one could see. The loss of Anna, her firstborn daughter, nearly 25 years ago. Anna's death had been labeled a tragic accident, a fall during a hiking trip. Margaret had never entirely believed it, though she buried her doubts for the sake of the family. Now, those doubts were stirring again, like ghosts unwilling to rest. Charles Collins, her husband, entered the kitchen carrying a stack of mail. At 62, Charles was a man of quiet dignity. His hair, once black, was peppered gray, and his beard, neatly trimmed, framed a face weathered by years of farm labor. His broad shoulders had carried more than just physical burdens. Charles had always been the rock of the family, calm and steady, though silence had cost him dearly. After Anna's death, he withdrew further into himself, spending hours in the workshop, hands busy with carpentry projects, voice scarce. His deep brown eyes were gentle, but they often seemed distant, as if focused on a horizon beyond anyone else's reach. "Bills, letters, and one from Albert," Charles said, dropping the mail onto the table. Albert Stone was their longtime lawyer, a man in his 70s, slim, meticulous, always wearing tweed jackets that smelled faintly of tobacco. He had guided them through farm contracts, property taxes, and even Anna's funeral arrangements years ago. The envelope from Albert was thick, official. Margaret frowned as Charles slid it open and read. "He says we should update our will," Charles murmured. Margaret felt her stomach twist. She knew this was coming. Lydia had mentioned it just a week ago during Sunday dinner, leaning across the table with her practiced concern. Lydia Black, born Collins, was 35 now, with long blonde hair that she wore in perfect waves, blue eyes as clear as glass, and a slender figure that carried itself with grace. Outwardly, she resembled her sister Anna, though without Anna's warmth. Lydia was sharp, ambitious, and always impeccably dressed, even for casual visits to her parents' farmhouse. She had a way of speaking that was persuasive, charming, but beneath her smile, Margaret often caught flickers of calculation. Her husband, David Black, had been equally persuasive when he entered their family. David was in his late 30s, tall with dark hair and a strong jawline. His neatly pressed shirts and polished shoes, a stark contrast to Charles' rugged flannels. He had once been an insurance broker, now self-employed, though rumors whispered of failed investments and debts. David carried himself with confidence, but his gray eyes were restless, scanning rooms, weighing opportunities, a man who feared scarcity more than he valued integrity. Margaret recalled their last conversation. "Mom, Dad," Lydia had said sweetly, placing her hand on Margaret's. "You're both getting older. It's important to have everything in order. David and I can handle things when the time comes. Make sure everything is fair." Fair. The word had rung hollow. Margaret had nodded at the time, unwilling to argue at the dinner table. But the unease lingered. She remembered glancing at Charles, who had simply looked down at his plate, chewing slowly, saying nothing. His silence had been his answer, and his silence was what unsettled her most. Margaret turned from the sink now and faced him. "Do you really think we should?" Charles folded the letter. "Maybe. Albert wouldn't suggest it otherwise." "But why now?" Margaret pressed. "Why all of a sudden?" Charles' brow furrowed. "Because Lydia asked him, perhaps. She wants to be prepared." Prepared. That word, too, chilled her. Margaret sank into a chair, clutching the edge of the table. Memories of Anna rushed back unbidden. Her laughter, her golden hair, the day they found her body at the base of the cliff. Margaret had wept until she could barely breathe, while Lydia, then only 10, had clung to her side in silence. That silence, Margaret realized now, had never ended. She closed her eyes, the ache pressing harder. Was it possible? Could Lydia have... No, she told herself. Lydia was a child back then. She couldn't have been involved. Yet something in her daughter's gaze lately, cold, fleeting, like a shadow behind glass, whispered otherwise. Margaret's heart pounded. If Anna's death wasn't an accident, then she and Charles had lived 25 years inside a lie. And if Lydia and David were so insistent on the will, perhaps that lie wasn't finished yet. Margaret looked at Charles, who sat quietly with the folded letter in his large hands. He was a good man, loyal, but he had always chosen peace over confrontation. She realized, with a sinking dread, that if there were to be questions asked, if truths were to be uncovered, it would have to be her. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the old fire of her instincts ignite. She would not let Anna's memory fade into silence, nor would she allow Lydia's polished charm to blind them again. The Collins farmhouse creaked with the evening wind, the last light fading across the meadow. Margaret sat upright, her mind restless. Change was coming, she could feel it, as sure as the autumn chill creeping through the walls. And with it, the haunting echo of Anna's laughter seemed to return, urging her not to ignore the truth any longer. The morning air was crisp and cool, with a faint mist clinging to the treetops as the family car wound its way up the narrow road toward the mountains. Margaret sat quietly in the back seat, her hands folded on her lap, feeling the leather beneath her palms. At 62, she was slender and tall, her posture still elegant though her face bore the fine lines of age. Her hair, a soft silver gray, was tied neatly into a bun at the nape of her neck, and her pale blue eyes carried the weight of many unspoken worries. Beside her sat Charles, her husband of nearly 4 decades, a stocky man with weathered skin and a neatly trimmed gray beard. His shoulders were broad, though age had begun to bend him slightly forward, and his brown eyes were thoughtful, always seeming to wander into places only he could see. Charles had always been patient, the sort of man who would rather endure hardship quietly than voice complaint. In the front seats sat Lydia and David. Lydia, their only surviving child, was in her late 30s, tall and striking with sharp cheekbones and glossy dark hair that fell just past her shoulders. She wore a fitted hiking jacket in deep green, her lips pressed in the faintest of smiles as she glanced at her mother through the rear-view mirror. Lydia's beauty had always drawn attention, but to Margaret, there was often something unsettling in the way her daughter's eyes hardened when money or status was discussed. David, her husband, was a broad-shouldered man of 40, with sandy hair cropped short and a square jaw that seemed permanently clenched. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to giving orders, his voice deep and edged with impatience when things did not go his way. He had grown up in a working-class household, fighting for every opportunity, and though his ambition had earned him success in real estate, it had also bred in him a hunger for control, one that Margaret had never trusted. The ride was filled with small talk, the kind that seemed rehearsed. Lydia pointed out trees, laughing lightly at nothing in particular, while David spoke about the fresh air and how good it would be for everyone to take a break from city life. But underneath the casual chatter, Margaret felt something dark stirring. Her chest tightened with an instinct she had learned never to ignore. When they arrived, the trail stretched before them, damp earth soft beneath their boots. The path wound upward, narrow and rocky, bordered by steep drops that opened into breathtaking views of the valley below. The scent of pine hung heavy in the air, and birds chirped in distant trees. Margaret tried to focus on the beauty around her, but the sound of Lydia's laugh, too sharp, too rehearsed, kept pulling her back into unease. As they climbed higher, Margaret's legs began to ache, and Charles reached for her arm to steady her. His touch was warm, reassuring, a silent reminder of the life they had shared. She looked at him and thought of their late daughter Anna, who had died so young. Anna had been gentle, soft-spoken, a contrast to Lydia's commanding presence. Even after all these years, Margaret's heart still ached with grief. She noticed Lydia stiffen at the mention of Anna's name earlier that morning, her eyes flashing with something unspoken, quickly buried under a smile. When they reached a narrow plateau near the summit, the wind grew stronger, pushing against them with invisible hands. Margaret stepped aside to catch her breath, leaning against a rock. That was when she heard it, the low, heated whisper of her daughter's voice. "David, we can't keep waiting," Lydia hissed, unaware her mother was only a few feet away. "The debts are piling up. You promised me this would be the answer." David's voice was gruff, low enough to make Margaret strain to hear. "I know, but we need to be careful. If anyone suspects—" "No one will suspect," Lydia snapped. "They're old. Everyone will think it was an accident. And without them, everything becomes ours." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her hand to her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. She turned to see Charles, who had paused a few steps below. His eyes met hers, and in that instant, she knew he had heard it too. His lips parted in disbelief, then tightened as though holding back a cry. Then Lydia said something that turned Margaret's blood cold. "Anna's death should have been enough, but you know how stubborn they are. They'll never let go until they're forced to." Margaret's knees weakened. Anna's death, had it not been the tragic accident they had believed? For years, Margaret had lived with the pain of losing her daughter, clinging to the story that fate had been cruel. But now, hearing Lydia's words, the possibility that Anna had been betrayed by her own sister shook her to her core. Before she could react, Lydia turned sharply. Her eyes locked on Margaret, and in them was no longer the daughter she had raised, but a cold determination. David stepped closer, his jaw set. "Mom, Dad," Lydia said, her voice too smooth, too calm. "Why don't you come closer to the edge? The view is spectacular from here." Margaret's instincts screamed. She reached for Charles's hand, but before they could move, David stepped behind them. The shove came fast, brutal. Margaret's world spun as she fell, the wind rushing past her ears, rocks scraping her skin. She heard Charles cry out her name before they both tumbled down the steep slope. The fall was merciless. Branches snapped against her body, stones tore at her arms, and pain exploded through her ribs. When she finally came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, the world tilted and blurred. For a moment, she thought death had claimed her, but then the searing pain in her chest told her she was still alive. Beside her, Charles lay motionless, blood streaking his forehead. Margaret struggled to breathe, every inhale sharp and ragged. Her mind reeled with betrayal, shock, and grief, but amidst the agony, a spark of will ignited. She could not let Lydia and David believe they had succeeded. She had to survive, not just for herself, but to expose the truth. As rescuers finally descended hours later, voices calling out through the trees, Margaret forced her body into stillness. She let her eyelids droop, her breathing shallow, feigning unconsciousness. From the corner of her eye, she saw Lydia and David rushing toward the paramedics, their faces masks of horror and concern. Lydia clutched her mother's limp hand, tears glistening perfectly on her lashes, and whispered, "Please, save her." Margaret did not move. Her heart burned with rage, but her mind was steady. She would not give them the satisfaction of knowing she was still aware. If they believed she was helpless, they might reveal more, and when the time came, she would be ready. For the first time in her life, Margaret's love for her daughter had turned to something unrecognizable, a quiet, searing hatred, tempered only by the determination to outlive this betrayal and fight back. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed faintly, casting a sterile glow across the pale linoleum floors. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, filling the halls with a rhythm both steady and cold. Inside room 214, Margaret lay still in the hospital bed, her body wrapped in bruises and her ribs screaming in silent agony with every shallow breath. To any passerby, she appeared unconscious, a fragile woman of 62 clinging faintly to life. But behind her closed lids, her mind was burning with fury and grief. She had learned to master her stillness. Every muscle was under command. It was the only shield she had left. Lydia entered first, her perfume, floral and sharp, slicing through the sterile air. She wore a fitted black blazer over a cream blouse, her hair neatly brushed to conceal the hours of chaos since the accident. The sharp click of her heels announced her presence like a queen entering her court. Her face carried perfectly staged sorrow, lips slightly parted, eyes glistening with controlled tears. To anyone else, she was the devastated daughter. But to Margaret, lying helpless, she was the predator circling its prey. David followed, his heavy boots striking the floor with quiet authority. He had changed into a dark gray jacket, his broad frame filling the doorway. His square jaw was clean-shaven, but the shadows under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights filled with debts and desperation. His voice, low and commanding, carried the weight of a man who had always believed the world owed him more than it gave. He closed the door softly behind him, and the room seemed to shrink under the suffocating air of their presence. Margaret heard Lydia's whisper first, sharp and venomous. "She looks terrible. I don't think she'll last long." David's response was a growl, though restrained. "Don't say that here. You never know who's listening." Lydia scoffed softly, leaning close to the bed. Her perfectly manicured hand brushed against Margaret's arm, a gesture that to outsiders might look tender, but felt to Margaret like a snake's caress. "You were always stubborn, Mom. But now you can finally rest. Everything will be better this way." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. The urge to open her eyes, to scream, to expose them for the monsters they were, nearly consumed her. But she forced herself to remain still, to keep the secret of her consciousness hidden. She knew that their arrogance might one day condemn them, but only if she lived long enough to tell. At that moment, the door creaked open again. A young nurse stepped inside, carrying a clipboard. Samantha was in her mid-20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and a smattering of freckles across her fair skin. She had kind green eyes that rarely hid what she felt, and though she was new to the ward, her compassion and quick instincts had already earned her quiet admiration among her colleagues. Today, however, she carried more than her usual professional demeanor. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her steps cautious as she approached the monitoring machine beside Margaret's bed. Samantha paused when she heard Lydia's hushed words. She froze, eyes widening, as if she had just stepped into a conversation she was never meant to hear. Her training told her to focus on the patient, but her gut told her something darker was unfolding in this room. She glanced briefly at Margaret, and that was when she saw it. The faintest twitch of a finger. Almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Her breath caught. Samantha leaned closer, pretending to adjust the IV line. "Mrs. Thompson?" She whispered so quietly even she barely heard herself. Her pulse raced. Was she imagining it? But then, the finger moved again, this time twice. Her mind spun. The patient was not unconscious. She was pretending. And if she was pretending, there had to be a reason. Samantha's instincts screamed that she had just stepped into a nightmare much larger than herself. She straightened slowly, her face carefully blank, so Lydia and David would see nothing unusual. "Is everything all right, nurse?" David asked, his voice edged with suspicion. His piercing eyes studied her closely, as though daring her to reveal what she had noticed. "Yes, sir," Samantha replied quickly, her tone professional and steady. "Just routine checks. Everything looks stable." She forced a smile, but inside her chest, her heart hammered like a drum. When Lydia and David finally left the room, murmuring about funeral arrangements and inheritance as though it were a natural continuation of life, Samantha exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned back to Margaret, lowering her voice again. "I know you can hear me. If you are in danger, move your finger 3 times. Margaret did not hesitate. 3 slow, deliberate movements. Samantha's throat tightened. A storm of emotions surged within her. Fear, determination, disbelief, but above all, a fierce need to protect this woman who had no one left to trust. She glanced toward the door, her mind racing. If she acted rashly, the wrong people would find out first. She needed allies. She needed someone with authority. With resolve, Samantha straightened and walked quickly down the hall. The chief physician was Dr. Howard Grant, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair, a pair of rimless glasses perched on his sharp nose, and an authoritative calm that had earned him respect over decades of service. His tall, lean frame carried an air of precision, and though his face was often serious, he was known for his quiet fairness with both patients and staff. When Samantha approached him, her voice trembled, but her conviction was clear. "Dr. Grant," she said, her eyes wide, "I need to speak to you, privately." Moments later, she was recounting what she had heard, what she had seen. At first, his brow furrowed in disbelief. But when he saw the earnest terror in her expression, he nodded. "Stay calm, Samantha. If what you're saying is true, we need to act carefully. I'll call the authorities immediately." Within half an hour, 2 police officers entered the hospital. One was Detective Marcus Reed, a man in his mid-40s with a square jaw darkened by stubble and eyes that had seen too much in his years of service. His navy suit was slightly wrinkled, and his tie loosened, but his demeanor radiated control and determination. He was known for being relentless, a man shaped by tragedy. His wife had died in an unsolved hit-and-run years earlier, and since then, he had carried a quiet vow to never let the guilty escape justice. Detective Reed entered Margaret's room with Dr. Grant and Samantha at his side. He leaned forward, his voice steady but gentle. "Ma'am, if you can hear me, you're safe now. We're here to protect you." The words pierced Margaret's fragile defenses. Slowly, painfully, she let her eyelids flutter open. The light was harsh, stabbing into her eyes, but when she finally focused, she saw faces filled with concern, not masks of deception. Relief washed through her, and tears welled in her eyes. "Thank God," Samantha whispered, clutching the clipboard to her chest. Margaret's voice came out raspy, strained from silence. "My daughter, my son-in-law, they pushed us." Detective Reed nodded, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "We'll need everything you can tell us, but for now, rest. They won't hurt you again." Outside in the waiting area, Lydia and David continued their performance. Lydia sobbed into a tissue, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face, while David consoled her with broad, protective arms. They looked every bit the grieving family, whispering to sympathetic passers-by. Yet upstairs, their masks were beginning to crack, the truth unraveling thread by thread. Margaret closed her eyes again, not to feign unconsciousness this time, but to summon the strength she would need for the battle ahead. Her betrayal cut deeper than her wounds, but with allies now at her side, she no longer felt entirely alone. The morning air around St. Mary's Hospital was heavy with a thin veil of mist, clinging to the glass windows and muffling the distant sounds of traffic. Inside, the sterile white corridors stretched endlessly, broken only by the echo of hurried footsteps and the soft beeping of medical machines. It was here, in this atmosphere of quiet tension, that Charles opened his eyes. Charles, a man in his late 60s, had always carried the look of someone used to responsibility. His frame was tall, but frail now, weakened by illness and the recent incident that had left him unconscious for days. His once dark hair had turned into a crown of silver, framing a face lined with the deep creases of worry and experience. A neatly trimmed mustache sat above his thin lips, and his piercing gray eyes, when they fluttered open, seemed to reflect both suspicion and relief at the same time. Charles had been a man of measured words, always calm and rational, though the betrayals within his family had carved deep wounds in his trust. When he stirred awake, the first object he demanded was his phone, a black device scratched at the edges, but still functional. In his hand, it trembled slightly, not only from weakness, but from the weight of what it carried. For on that phone were recordings that would shatter the facade Lydia and David had so carefully constructed. Nurse Samantha, the young woman who had earlier discovered Margaret's subtle movements, stood near the doorway. Her brown eyes, wide and vigilant, darted between Charles and the corridor, as though aware that danger could slip in at any moment. She had reported everything she knew, but she also felt an instinctive need to protect the old man who now seemed to hold the key to the truth. A shadow appeared in the doorway. Detective Miller, the man assigned to the case. Detective Harold Miller was in his early 50s, a broad-shouldered figure with a rugged exterior that reflected years of facing the darker corners of humanity. His square jaw was covered with a day's stubble, giving him a perpetually tired look, but his steel blue eyes carried an intensity that made most people uneasy. He had joined the force after a tragic incident in his youth when his younger sister had been lost to a violent crime. That event had shaped him into the relentless investigator he was, unwilling to let lies or manipulations obscure the truth. When Charles handed him the phone, Miller's large, calloused hands held it carefully, as though cradling both evidence and confession. He pressed play. Lydia's voice spilled from the speaker first, sharp and venomous, discussing the easiest way to secure their parents' estate. David's tone followed, hesitant but equally damning, mentioning Anna, the relative who had died under circumstances too strange to be dismissed as mere accident. The words were chilling. They spoke of forged documents, staged conversations, and even a plan to hasten Margaret and Charles's passing. Miller's expression hardened. His instincts had whispered that the grieving daughter and supportive son-in-law were playing roles too perfectly, but this was the confirmation he needed. He glanced at Charles, who lay back against the pillow, his chest rising and falling with effort. Charles's internal world was a storm. Anguish pressed against his ribs, not just from betrayal, but from the realization that the daughter he had once cradled in his arms, the little girl he had taught to ride a bicycle, had turned into someone who plotted his death. The thought made his throat tighten. "Why?" he whispered to himself, a sound so soft even Samantha barely heard. Meanwhile, Miller dug deeper. He instructed officers to discreetly search David's belongings. It was Officer Ramirez, a tall young man with cropped black hair and a straightforward demeanor, who returned with the discovery. From David's worn gray backpack, he pulled out a small digital recorder. Miller switched it on, and once again, the couple's voices emerged. The conversation was clearer this time, with David worrying about the timing and Lydia snapping back with irritation. "They're weak already," Lydia's voice hissed through the device. "It won't take much longer. Once it's done, everything will be ours." Miller clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening around the recorder. The pieces were falling into place. Financial desperation, a pattern of fraud, and now, premeditated murder. He ordered his team to begin a background check into Lydia's financial history, and soon reports trickled in. Unpaid debts, loan sharks knocking at her door, forged signatures on withdrawal slips from her mother's bank account. Each detail painted her greed with sharper strokes. Charles, listening to the updates, closed his eyes. Memories flooded him. Lydia as a child, laughing in the garden, bringing him wildflowers, clinging to his hand on the first day of school. His heart ached, but beneath that ache simmered something harder: resolve. He had been a man who avoided conflict his entire life, preferring diplomacy over confrontation. But now, staring at the truth of what his daughter had become, he knew there could be no forgiveness. Margaret, still confined to her bed, moved slightly when Miller entered her room later. She could not yet speak fully, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, met his. He understood her silent message. She, too, had heard enough. The time for pretending was over. In the hallway, Lydia and David continued their performance of worried relatives, holding hands and sighing dramatically for the benefit of other visitors. But Miller's steps, as he approached, carried a different weight now. He no longer saw them as family members in grief, but as suspects under surveillance. The hospital, with its antiseptic smell and hushed tones, had become the stage where truth was finally stripping away their masks. Rain lashed against the hospital windows that afternoon, turning the glass panes into a distorted mirror of the storm raging outside. The low rumble of thunder merged with the steady hum of medical equipment, creating an atmosphere that felt heavy, charged, as though the world itself anticipated what was about to unfold. Inside the corridor, Lydia paced nervously, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She was a woman in her early 40s, of average height, with sharp cheekbones and deep-set hazel eyes that had once been admired for their beauty, but now carried a restless, almost predatory gleam. Her auburn hair, carefully styled into waves, framed a face marred by the tension of sleepless nights and financial desperation. She tugged at the sleeve of her beige coat, feigning composure, though her thoughts raced wildly. If the police hadn't found anything yet, perhaps she and David still had a chance to escape this nightmare. David stood a few steps behind her, leaning against the wall with arms crossed. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, with a rugged face partly hidden by a trimmed beard. His brown hair had begun to thin at the temples, and his dark eyes shifted uneasily toward every passerby. David had grown up in a working-class family, a childhood marked by poverty and a father's violent temper, scars that had made him ambitious, but also easily tempted by shortcuts. Now, as Lydia's partner in crime, he balanced between loyalty and self-preservation. The two exchanged brief glances, silent accusations passing between them even before the police arrived. The sudden echo of heavy boots broke the uneasy rhythm of the hallway. Detective Harold Miller entered first, his coat damp from the rain, followed by two uniformed officers and Officer Ramirez at his side. Ramirez's youthful energy contrasted with Miller's hardened demeanor. His sharp eyes missed nothing, and he carried himself with the brisk decisiveness of someone who believed in swift justice. "Lydia Collins? David Turner?" Miller's voice cut through the corridor, calm but authoritative. Lydia stiffened, her lips parting as though to protest, but the words faltered. David's jaw clenched. In a matter of seconds, the officers stepped forward, producing handcuffs that gleamed coldly under the fluorescent lights. Gasps erupted from nearby patients and visitors who had paused to witness the commotion. Margaret, still confined to her hospital bed but alert, could hear the commotion from her room. She turned her head weakly toward Charles, her husband, who had managed to sit up in bed. Their eyes met, both filled with grief and vindication. Lydia's voice cracked the silence. "This is a mistake. You can't do this to me. I'm the victim here." She turned sharply toward David, pointing a trembling finger. "He forced me into everything. He planned it all, the money, the signatures, even Anna's death." David's face flushed with fury. "You liar. You were the one who dragged me into this mess. I wanted out months ago, but you said we'd lose everything if I didn't help." His voice grew louder, almost shouting, drawing the attention of doctors and nurses gathering around. "You told me Anna was weak, that no one would question her accident." The words hung in the air, heavier than the thunder rolling outside. Miller, standing between them, remained expressionless, though his heart beat faster. Confessions in public were rare, and here they were tearing into each other, unraveling their conspiracy piece by piece without any pressure. Ramirez quickly pulled out a notepad, scribbling every damning word. Lydia, realizing her mistake, tried to backtrack. No, that's not what I meant. He's twisting everything. I only wanted to protect my family." But her voice trembled, betraying her panic. She felt the eyes of strangers drilling into her, judging, condemning. The perfect image she had tried to uphold was shattered beyond repair. David shook his head, spitting his words with venom. "Protect? You only cared about money, Lydia. You forged signatures, you lied, and you made me your accomplice. You think anyone will believe you now?" Around them, phones had begun to appear, patients' relatives and staff recording the scandal. The digital age allowed no secrets, and within hours the footage would find its way online, spreading like wildfire. Miller gave a short nod to his officers, and Lydia and David's hands were bound behind them. The clinking of metal cuffs was final, merciless. Lydia screamed, her voice echoing down the sterile corridor. "You'll regret this! You'll all regret this!" David, quieter now, dropped his gaze, the fight draining from him as reality settled in. The once proud man looked smaller, broken, as though the weight of his past and present sins had finally collapsed on him. In another wing of the hospital, Margaret closed her eyes. She felt tears forming, not of weakness, but of sorrow for the child she had raised, who now stood exposed as a criminal. Charles, gripping her frail hand, whispered, "It's over now. The truth is no longer ours to carry alone." By evening, the news had broken nationwide. Headlines screamed across television screens and online platforms. The Collins family betrayal. Commentators discussed it with shock, painting Lydia and David as symbols of greed and moral decay. Journalists described the hospital arrest in vivid detail, replaying the video of their public quarrel as if it were the climax of a tragic play. Neighbors who had once envied the Collins family's stability shook their heads in disbelief. The betrayal had not only destroyed bonds within the family, but had become a spectacle for an entire nation. Detective Miller, reviewing the footage later in his office, exhaled slowly. The case was far from finished. Trials, testimonies, and deeper financial investigations. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long beams of light across the polished wooden floor that smelled faintly of varnish and dust. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, but inside, the atmosphere was heavy, saturated with tension and the quiet anticipation of justice finally being served. Margaret Collins sat on the hard bench reserved for witnesses, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was 60 years old, her once dark hair now a dignified silver tied in a simple bun. Deep lines traced her face, not merely from age, but from grief and betrayal. Her dress was plain navy, her shoes practical, yet there was an undeniable strength in her bearing. Margaret's heart thudded against her ribs as she stole a glance at Lydia, the daughter she had raised with hope, love, and sacrifice, yet who now seemed to her nothing but a hollow shell. Lydia Collins sat at the defendant's table, 35 years old, her blonde hair styled in deliberate waves that gleamed under the courtroom lights. She wore a fitted red blazer over a black skirt, projecting confidence she did not feel. Her pale skin betrayed a sheen of sweat, and though her lips twisted into occasional smirks, her eyes darted nervously to the jury as if searching for sympathy. Lydia had always been beautiful, always drawn to appearances, but today that beauty seemed sharp, brittle, almost venomous. Beside her was David Collins, her husband of 8 years. At 38, David had once possessed a charm that made people overlook the calculating glint in his brown eyes. His short, dark hair was slicked back, though strands had begun to thin. A trimmed beard framed his jaw, but the stubble seemed less a choice and more the neglect of a man who had slept poorly. He wore a gray suit, the tie loosened as if choking him. David's posture slumped, his gaze fixed on the table, betraying a man who was beginning to realize the weight of the walls closing in. Charles Collins, Margaret's husband, sat quietly in the gallery. He was 62, broad-shouldered despite age, with graying hair combed neatly. His face bore deep creases, shaped by years of carpentry and the silent endurance of loss. Charles rarely spoke in public, preferring the company of his tools and the honesty of wood. Yet today he was present, his dark eyes fixed unblinking on the two who had conspired against their family. He had woken that morning with his chest tight, as though the trial was not just a legal proceeding, but a crucible for his entire life. The jury was composed of 12 men and women of varying ages, each instructed to carry impartiality, though their gazes lingered long on Lydia's poised form and David's sweat-stained collar. Behind them, the courtroom buzzed faintly with journalists, their pens scratching against paper, cameras poised, waiting to capture every shattering word. The headline, "The Collins Family Betrayal," had already dominated newspapers for weeks, and now it was to be sealed in history. At the center of it all stood Judge Harrison, a man of 55 with a bald crown and sharp, hawk-like features. He wore his black robe as though it weighed no more than his own skin. His voice carried authority born of decades of presiding over justice, and though his eyes betrayed no personal bias, the heaviness in his brow revealed he understood the gravity of what this case represented. Detective Samuel Miller was called to the stand first. Miller was 45, a man with a sturdy build and short black hair salted with gray. His square jaw carried a day's shadow of stubble, and his expression was perpetually grave, a result of too many nights combing through crime scenes where human cruelty had left scars. Miller had joined the force young, once known for his optimism, but years of broken families and unanswered cries had made him sober, deliberate, yet deeply committed to truth. Miller laid out the evidence with precision. He held up bank records, pages of forged signatures in Lydia's handwriting, checks drained, investments faked. He presented the small black recorder found in David's backpack, its metallic body gleaming under the courtroom lights. From the speakers came the voices of Lydia and David, cold and calculating, discussing debts, plotting manipulation, even mentioning Anna, their late sister, whose death had long lingered in shadows. Each word spilled into the room like poison, stripping away any lingering doubt of their guilt. Margaret's hands trembled as the recordings played. She could still remember Anna's laugh, warm and musical, a melody now forever silenced. Anna had been gentle, auburn-haired with soft freckles across her nose, the kind of woman who cared more for others than herself. Margaret closed her eyes as Lydia's voice in the tape described Anna's death as an opportunity, a chance to consolidate control. Her stomach churned. She had once cradled Lydia as a baby, had believed in the goodness of her daughter, and yet here was proof that whatever goodness had once existed was long gone. When it was Margaret's turn, she rose slowly to the witness stand. Her steps echoed in the chamber, and for a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Margaret placed her hands on the wooden rail, her voice firm but heavy with sorrow. "My daughter died with Anna," she said, eyes locked on Lydia. "The woman before you is not my child, but a stranger wearing her face." The words sliced through Lydia's facade. For the first time, her expression faltered. She looked at her mother, perhaps searching for some flicker of softness, but Margaret's face was carved in stone, grief and fury woven together. David muttered angrily to Lydia, and in his panic, he blurted out half-confessions that only confirmed the prosecution's case. The two began to blame each other, voices rising, gestures frantic. "Judge," Harrison slammed his gavel, restoring order, though the damage to their defense was irreparable. Their unraveling had been witnessed by everyone, the jury, the press, the parents whose trust they had shattered. The prosecutor, a sharp-minded woman named Evelyn Price, pressed the advantage. Evelyn was in her early 40s, tall and slender with chestnut hair pulled into a bun, glasses perched on her nose. Known for her relentless logic and icy composure, she dissected Lydia's financial records, exposed David's debts, and reminded the jury of the tape that spoke louder than any denial. Her voice was steady, not emotional, but with each sentence, she seemed to nail the coffin shut. Hours stretched into days, but at last, the closing arguments were heard, and the jury retreated. Margaret clutched Charles's hand, her knuckles white. She thought of the grandchildren, innocent, bewildered children who would grow up knowing their parents had chosen greed and violence over love. The weight was unbearable, but eventually the jury filed back, their expressions solemn. Judge Harrison read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Lydia Collins and David Collins were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The gavel struck like thunder, and the room erupted into a storm of whispers, pens scratching furiously as journalists chronicled history. Margaret's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. She felt no triumph, only a hollow relief. Justice had been served, but the cost was a daughter lost forever, a family torn apart. As she left the courtroom, her eyes fell on the photograph of Anna pinned to her handbag. Margaret whispered softly to the memory of her gentle child. "Justice, my darling. Justice at last." The spring morning unfolded gently, the garden behind the Collins house blooming with daffodils and tulips, their colors splashed like paint across fresh green grass. The air carried the fragrance of damp earth and new life, a season of beginnings that Margaret had never thought she would live to see. It had been a year since the trial, a year since Lydia and David had been sentenced to life behind bars, their names whispered in disgust in every corner of the country. A year since Margaret and Charles had stood before a family court, pleading not for themselves, but for the fragile futures of their grandchildren. And today, those futures played in the sunlight. On the grass, little Emily twirled with clumsy grace. She was 7 years old, with golden hair that shimmered in the sunlight, tied into 2 uneven braids by Margaret's careful hands. Her eyes were a soft green, curious and gentle, often shadowed with sadness that no child should carry. Emily's dress was yellow cotton, a gift from a kind neighbor, and though it was simple, she spun in it as though she wore a princess gown. Beside her, 5-year-old Noah chased after a small puppy that bounded happily across the yard. Noah had chestnut hair cut too short, revealing a stubborn cowlick that always sprang up. His brown eyes mirrored both mischief and longing, a child desperate for stability, but still unbroken by cruelty. He wore overalls slightly too big for his thin frame, hand-me-downs from a friend of Charles's workshop. The puppy, a black and white mutt named Scout, was only 6 months old, with floppy ears and paws too large for his body. Scout's tail wagged so furiously that his whole body seemed to wriggle as he barked at Noah in playful challenge. Margaret sat on the porch, watching the children with a tender ache in her heart. She had imagined her 60s to be quieter years, gardening, reading, perhaps traveling with Charles. Instead, her days were filled with homework checks, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the quiet sobs of children waking from nightmares. Yet she did not regret it. For Margaret, there was no greater calling than to mend what had been broken. Charles joined her on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of tea. His hands, calloused from decades of carpentry, trembled slightly with age, but his steps remained steady. He set the mug before Margaret and lowered himself into the rocking chair beside her. His face was rugged, tanned from hours under the sun, lines carved deep by grief and resilience. Unlike Margaret, Charles rarely spoke of Lydia anymore. His silence was both shield and wound, his way of carrying a grief too heavy to voice. They sat in companionable quiet, listening to the laughter in the garden. Margaret broke the silence, her voice soft. "They're beginning to smile again, Charles. Do you see it? Not just with their mouths, but with their eyes." Charles nodded, though his gaze lingered on Noah. He carries it the hardest, Charles said quietly. That boy remembers too much. More than he should. It was true. Noah often froze at sudden noises, eyes wide as though bracing for unseen threats. At night, he sometimes whispered for his mother, then quickly bit his lip as though ashamed. Margaret would stroke his hair, whispering that it was all right to remember, all right to love, even if love had been betrayed. In the evenings, Margaret had begun telling the children stories of Anna. She would describe their aunt's kindness, her auburn hair and freckles, the way she laughed as though she held sunlight in her chest. Emily always listened with wide eyes, asking questions, while Noah curled against Margaret's side, silently absorbing every word. Margaret believed it was important to keep Anna alive in their hearts, a counterbalance to the poison their parents had left behind. The social worker assigned to their case, Sarah Mitchell, visited often. Sarah was 32, tall and slender with chestnut curls tied back neatly. Her skin was fair, and her hazel eyes carried both warmth and weariness. Years of working with fractured families had hardened her resolve, yet had also deepened her compassion. Sarah had grown up in foster care herself, shuffled from home to home, never knowing permanence until she built it on her own. Perhaps that was why she worked tirelessly to protect children like Emily and Noah, ensuring they would never feel abandoned. During her visits, Sarah always crouched to the children's level, speaking gently, never rushing them. Emily liked her immediately, often showing her drawings of flowers and suns. Noah was slower to trust, but Sarah never pressed. She simply returned each week, offering stability through consistency. Today, she stood at the edge of the porch, clipboard tucked under her arm, watching the children with a faint smile. "They're healing," Sarah said softly. "It won't happen overnight, but it's happening. You've given them what they need most: safety." Margaret exhaled shakily. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough, if we're enough." Sarah's gaze softened. "You are. They don't need perfection. They need love. And they have that, more than ever." That night, as the sky faded to twilight, Margaret gathered the children into the living room. A small lamp cast a warm glow across the old family photos on the mantel. Scout curled up at their feet, snoring softly. Emily held her stuffed rabbit, worn at the ears, while Noah leaned against Margaret's side, his thumb tucked in his mouth. Margaret opened a leather-bound journal, Anna's journal, found among her belongings after her death. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, pressed flowers, and small sketches of gardens. Margaret read aloud passages about kindness, about hope, about choosing light even in dark times. Emily's eyes glistened, and Noah reached out to touch the pressed violet on the page. "She sounds like an angel," Emily whispered. "She was," Margaret replied, her voice thick. "And she would want you both to grow with kindness in your hearts, to be brave, even when the world feels cruel." Charles sat quietly in the armchair, watching his wife and grandchildren. For the first time in years, a small smile softened his face. He thought of the long road they had walked. Betrayal, loss, courtroom battles, but here, in this small circle of light, he felt a fragile peace. As the children drifted to sleep, Margaret tucked them into bed. She lingered at the doorway, whispering a silent prayer that their dreams would be filled not with fear, but with fields of flowers and laughter. Downstairs, she joined Charles by the fire. They sat in silence, hands entwined, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new hope. Margaret looked into the flames and thought, perhaps for the first time in years, that life could still be beautiful.